Well, good morning, everybody. It really has been a while since I've done one of these. Obviously, it's 2020, and gestures vaguely at everything. Things have been rough on everybody, and myself included, so I just have not had the time, energy, or motivation to do one of these. But we're starting a new season. I'm hoping to be a little bit more consistent this time around. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to come up with a new name for this series because, as you can tell, I'm not on a morning walk. So I don't know, maybe morning talks with Ichi? I don't know. Possibly something like that. But a lot has changed, and I don't really use this as a blog or a vlog in the traditional sense, so I'm not going to go into absolutely everything that's going on. But the biggest change is that, I've got a little one on the way now. I'm expecting a little girl sometime in the middle of January. And let me tell you, I've never been more scared in my entire life. My growing up was definitely not as hard as a lot of people's, but it wasn't really a cakewalk either. My parents made a number of mistakes, just like parents tend to do. But the upshot is that they are the primary source for how I learned to parent. Their mentality, the way they disciplined, the patterns of behavior, that was my first imprint. There's a lot of things actually that I would keep the same. There's a few things I would do differently. But it doesn't mean that I'm not terrified out of my mind. Being the oldest of 6, I helped out a lot around the house. And obviously, everybody can always do more. And my parents did their best not to expect too much out of me, but I still had to do a lot. And in the later years, to one degree or another, I had a hand in raising my siblings. And I recognize and realize what a huge responsibility it is to be responsible for bringing a new life into the world, and just the weight of what it means to be the person that has to teach that child everything properly is monumental. And as I've been thinking about this and mulling this over and trying desperately to adjust to this new change in my life, it's got me thinking a lot about the concept of fear. And I know I've done one of these about fear before, but as I've gotten older and gotten a little bit more stable, and I've grown up a little bit more, fear starts to mean something a little bit different when you're older. It starts to become almost familiar. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but when you're young, fear is something that you try to avoid. You don't know how to handle it. It paralyzes you. It shuts you down. But the more you have to deal with fear in your life, the better you get at handling it. It almost becomes like a frenemy. And that's how fear has become for me, because there's been so much in my life that's made me afraid. But I've made it this far. And each and every one of those challenges I've managed to overcome somehow. And so this time around, the fear is a little bit different. It still feels like a semi-truck bearing down on me, but this time around, I feel almost like I have a rough idea of exactly how to sidestep, how to jump out of the way. It's kind of like, I feel like dealing with fear is a lot like sparring in martial arts. When you first start to learn how to fight, especially when you're dealing with a more experienced opponent, you've got no idea what's incoming. You know the person training you is better than you. You know they're faster. You know that they're more experienced. And there is a degree of fear that associates with that. I mean, they're a better fighter. And you have no idea what's coming. You've got no idea where the blows are going to land, what's going to happen, how much they're going to hurt. And the first, I don't know how many fights are just chaos and just barely trying to survive one step at a time. But as you get older, as you get more experienced, as you learn more, you start to be able to anticipate where the blows come from. You start to be able to anticipate where the strikes are going to land, how much they're going to hurt, and you start to develop patterns to deal with set strikes. And that, I think, is how one starts to deal with fear as time goes on. You start to see familiar patterns, familiar shapes. The threats that you face in your day-to-day life start to fall within specific categories, and you start to have plans and ideas of how to handle them. But it doesn't mean that each individual situation isn't still scary. My grandfather has been a source of, or was the source of, a lot of wisdom in my life. And I think it was him that told me this truth. He said, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and taking the step forward anyway. Both he and my mom and my dad all told me when we used to go over Bible stories in the evenings, and they all three at separate times talked to me about the story of David and Goliath. David, this shepherd boy who was literally just delivering a meal to his older brothers who were on the front line, and the enemy army had brought forth Goliath, who was this 9-foot-tall giant, and challenged them to single combat, basically saying, if you can beat Goliath, you win, but if Goliath beats you, then you lose, we take over. And nobody could handle it. David stepped up with his sling that he used to guard his sheep and slew Goliath with a single stone. And that story is oftentimes held up to us as an example of courage, and it is. It's an excellent example of courage. But what my mom, my dad, and my grandfather were all very quick to point out to me is that David was still afraid. David didn't have an absence of fear. What made David brave, what made him courageous, is the fact that he was terrified, and he stepped up to face that giant anyway. So I guess if I had a point for today's little video, it would be twofold. Number one, we all face challenges, we all face difficulties, we all face things that genuinely make us afraid. There is no shame in fear. Fear is a natural reaction. It's something that we all face together. But there is a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, because as time goes on, fear, it's not that it gets easier to face, but that it becomes something that is more familiar to handle. And I think the older that you get and the more grounded you become in who you are and the things that you've faced, the simpler it becomes to push past your fear. I guess the second point would be that you can be courageous and still be afraid. There is no shame in being afraid, as long as you take that final step forward. Be strong and courageous, everybody. Don't be afraid. But if you are afraid, just remember to take that first step.